Morning. Hope everyone can hear us. Welcome to VICA's 32nd Annual Business Forecast Conference. This is the housing panel. My name is Josh Gertler. I'll be your moderator today. I am a very long time board member of VICA, past chair of the Land Use Committee, past chair of the Transportation Committee, and my day job is as president and CEO of Consensus, a public relations and public affairs firm. Consensus is honored to support and sponsor this panel today, along with Sheppard Mullin, with whom we have Jack Rubens and the Southland Regional Association of Realtors. I'd also like to take a minute and thank our track sponsors, California Lutheran University and Kaiser Permanente. Before we get started, I want to let you know that you can find biographies for all of our panelists in the journal and online. And now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. In alphabetical order, we have Greg Ames, Managing Director, Trammell Crow Company. Greg, raise your hand, you can see his name. We have Vince Bertoni, the Director of Planning for Los Angeles City's Planning Department. We have Dr. Ran Lou Andrews, the Director and Assistant Professor of Business Administration from Cal Lutheran University. And we have Jack Rubens, who's a partner in the land use group with Sheppard Mullin. So what I'd like to do is just set the stage for this panel. What we'll do is I'll set the stage with kind of a context statement. We'll go around, each panelist will spend a couple minutes with an opening remarks. Then I'll ask each panelist a question. And then after that, we'll turn it over to the audience to ask questions. Now, if you're either watching this on Zoom or on Pathable, you can submit your questions by way of either platform. And let's begin. So here we are. We're all working from home or something like home. We are sitting amidst a once-in-a-century pandemic. And yet here we are with a continuing severe housing crisis for the state, for the city. And so all of us who are in the housing world are looking to bring our resources together to build more housing and do it as quickly as possible. So what I'd like to talk about a number of things. One, how do we build more affordable housing? Two, where will we build it and what kind of housing will actually get built? Three, look at how developers are reacting and will adjust to the post-pandemic rules. And so with that, that's kind of the stage setting I'd like to begin with. So let me start with Greg. So Greg, what are some of the challenges, or sorry, you go ahead and take 2 minutes for your opening statement.
Oh, sure, and we're happy to dive right into it equally. It'll all come out. But just by way of introduction, I run the Greater Los Angeles region at Trammell Crow Company. We are a national real estate developer. Our production stats were released this morning. We have about $17 billion of projects under development and pipeline in 18 markets across the U.S. And Los Angeles is clearly one of the most important, not just because we're LA, but because of the diversity of our job market, the population base that we have, and the great potential that we have here in the state of California. In the LA office, specific to housing, because that's what we're talking about today, we have over 3,000 units of multifamily that's either in lease up or planned for development or in entitlements or otherwise in our pipeline. And it's spread across the greater LA region. So, housing as a product type at Trammell Crow Company and in our housing subsidiary, High Street Residential, we're very, very focused on housing policy and housing production and the things that we collectively need to be doing to make it more successful and streamline its delivery. We're out there every single day fighting to keep these projects alive because we look at what we're going through in LA County on the whole. We're the second least affordable county in the United States next to San Francisco as it relates to housing. And so the onus is on every single one of us to play our parts in the process in order to facilitate the delivery of housing. And it's sticky and it's hard, and some of those conversations are very, very unpopular. But the onus is on every single one of us. Not just those of us in the real estate and the development community, but even just the citizens and the populations and the businesses here. We all will succeed or fail based on how we do or do not address the crisis. So couldn't be happier to be here on this panel, and couldn't be happier to have this topic, Josh.
Thank you, Greg. Let's turn it over to Vince. I'd like to take a few minutes and give an opening statement.
Sure. Thanks. And again, thanks for inviting me on the panel. Always appreciate to be able to come join VICA. Unfortunately, I won't be able to be there physically with you all, which is always great. But I do appreciate being on the panel. As we all know, this is the Department of City Planning. We have kind of broad responsibilities of looking at both long-range policy when it comes to housing in the city, as well as when an individual project comes in and kind of everything in between that when it comes to housing. Separate Department of Building and Safety in terms of issuing the permits. But we do the long-range policy as well as the projects when they come in, making sure that they comply. We're in a housing crisis, and I think everyone really understands that. And I think we've been in a housing crisis for many years, and we have very visible examples of what happens in a housing crisis. You have people who are unhoused and then they end up being on the street, and that's happening all over Los Angeles. And so this is something that we take very seriously. We're having this conversation in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of an economic crisis, in the midst of an important conversation about racial justice and equity in the country. So all of these things are happening at the same time as we move into, as we try to look to see what we can do to build more housing here in Los Angeles, and making sure that we build it for a variety of income levels. We have to really think very carefully about that. So it can't just all be high-end housing. We have to look at how do we build a variety of types and have some that's deed restricted to be affordable over for the long term. And so those are the things that we've been really spending some time on. We had to spend a lot of time kind of transitioning to COVID-19. In a matter of a few days, like everyone else, everyone had to change their operations. And for us, it was really important to keep our operations going as much as possible. So we actually kept all of our operations going as we transitioned in COVID-19. So we did not close our public counters in terms of their activity. What we did was close them physically to the public. We still have some employees coming in. So as you go through the process to do your entitlements, we maintain the entire time the ability to turn in your applications, whether it's, we call it contactless in not a physical drop box that we do at our development service centers, as well as moving our projects through the project planning process. We had to transition to online meetings. So we've gone through this transition period, and everything's up and running in terms of the COVID-19 world. So this is an interesting, challenging time for us, but we also want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the importance of housing, and housing all Angelenos is part of that.
Man, I'd like to ask you to take a couple minutes to provide some opening thoughts.
Thank you, Josh. Pleasure to be here, and super excited to be invited to be on this panel on the housing market. My name is Randall Andrews. I work for Cal Lutheran University up here in Thousand Oaks, California, in Ventura County. And most of my research interests are surrounding real estate. I've done quite a bit of research in commercial real estate market and real estate investment trusts. And lately, since about 2014, I've been working on some housing research as well. And I used to live in Connecticut. Well, it's not that cheap to live in Connecticut, but then I moved to Ventura County, and then it's way more expensive than Connecticut. So from the data, the housing affordability is an issue, whether it's from a general housing affordability on the federal level, the national level, looking at it, or just on the regional level. And I think I'm trying to, I'm not trying to be the unpopular professor here, but there's a lot of things that we're doing is not really about the policy, or it's not really about the regulation. Sometimes it's about the enforcement of the regulation or the resource allocation. It's like which neighborhood we should develop, which neighborhood should get priority, and what quality of housing. And in academic research, there's a lot of gap because of the lack of data availability. We don't really know the quality of the housing we're providing, and how is that gonna, because it's related to the cost, how is that gonna affect the completion of the construction or the application process of each region as well. And of course, there are a lot of literature already talk about, the tax credit program, which is the most successful program that we have for the past 30 years. But how do we actually improve it to make sure that developers can actually allocate the resources, the capitals, and into the neighborhood that actually desperately deserve to be so. And there's a lot of research that I'm very excited to do in the future on those topics as well. And also lately because in Ventura County, we have a very significant senior population. I'm also looking at the senior housing constructions, things like that, which we can touch base on that later on in our discussion as well. But all in all, very excited to be here. And hopefully we're gonna have some new information coming out of this panel. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you, Ran. And Mel Wilson has joined us. Mel will come to you right after we go to Jack, but we're asking everybody to take a 2 minutes or so to just offer some opening thoughts about housing. So Jack, again, partner Sheppard Mullin, I'd like to open up the floor to you.
Thank you, Josh, and it's a pleasure to be here. Also, by way of introduction, our firm has a pretty sizable land use presence throughout the state. We have dozens of lawyers who specialize in various aspects of land use law. We have a 15-person group just in our downtown Los Angeles office where I work. And interestingly, our work has continued pretty much unabated. We remain exceedingly busy with a whole range of projects, development projects in the pipeline for our developer clients, many of which, probably most of which, involve exclusively or in large part housing. And that's because we have a housing crisis. I think the reason for that is that the hope and expectation of our clients is that, given that the entitlement process takes a while and then you have to actually construct these buildings, by the time they get their entitlements and build the projects that they have in the pipeline right now, the pandemic will be over, and hopefully there will actually be a pent-up demand for housing at that point. But that said, we are clearly hearing from our clients, from some of them at least, that they are concerned with the whole development climate in the city, with the impact of COVID-19 and how that's affected their ability to entitle, build, and rent or sell units. Some of you may have participated in the Hollywood Economic Summit a couple of weeks ago, where we heard John Kilroy speak at length and in great detail about why he currently is unwilling to develop any further projects in either Los Angeles or San Francisco for a number of reasons. And he was so incensed that he openly discussed his willingness to back candidates to achieve political change in those cities. I'm not sure I've heard anybody else go quite to those lengths, but I've certainly heard a number of comments from other developers who are well known to all of us, who do a lot of work here in Los Angeles and are crucial to our ability to deal with the housing crisis, who are concerned about doing more projects here. And that's something maybe we can talk about. And I hope a little later I can chat about some of the ways in which the entitlement process can be expedited and the cost of that process be somewhat reduced to encourage developers to stay in the city and continue to build the housing that we so vitally need.
Jack. And again, joining us is Mel Wilson from the Southland Regional Association of Realtors, one of our sponsors today. And Mel, thanks for joining us. I'd like to open up the floor to you to take a couple minutes to offer some thoughts about context of housing today.
Thanks, Josh. And Vince, good seeing you again. Jack and Greg and Dr. Andrews, good to meet you. I've been in the real estate space for about 40 plus years now as a realtor and also as an asset manager and the advocate, the housing advocate for our region's largest real estate trade association. So, you know, and having served in that capacity and also on the Metropolitan Transportation Authority Board for Mayor Reardon, and again, 4 years later for Mayor Villaraigosa, I have a lot that I think I can share with respect to, you know, transit-oriented development, transit community development, housing, and the like. We have some real serious problems here in LA. And, you know, prior to COVID, California was already suffering an acute housing shortage with over 1 million housing units short over the last decade, according to the California the Department of Housing and Community Development. This shortage is primarily created by artificial constraints, I would say. And I'd like to get into that a little bit later. But a couple facts, over 40% of Angelenos today pay 50% or more of their household income on rent. And that leaves very little room for air on anything else. Over a third of the Angelenos, only a third, can afford to buy a house in the LA metro area. If you look at the San Fernando Valley, that number is even lower. The typical home in the San Fernando Valley now is $830,000. Let me repeat that. $830,000 for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,500 square foot home. So those prices during the pandemic have actually gone up, which is kind of crazy. So according to the USA Today, last month, over 6 million Americans were either behind on their rent or could not make their mortgage payment. And so we have to look at what's going on here. There are a number of government mandates that have shuttered businesses. And I believe that there are going to be some opportunities, despite the devastation from the loss of thousands and thousands of businesses. Many of them are our favorite restaurants, will not be opening back. But there's a change in behavior that I've observed over the last 5 months. And that is folks are learning to adapt around the pandemic. Telework is becoming much more prevalent. Telehealth is a part of the norm today. Telecommuting is where everybody is at, and online education. And so those behavioral changes, I think, are going to create some opportunities in the commercial real estate space. As we see the demand softening for commercial, retail, and office space, I think that makes opportunities for repurposing, adaptive reuse, and mixed-use development, which includes housing all throughout our county and our region. The last thing I'd like to say is I see a confluence of this change in behavior, and it's going to be incumbent upon government, the private sector, and the public sector, and those to get more engaged and to provide and be willing to offer incentives to develop housing, particularly for the workforce. We've lost almost 1 million of our workers in the 100,000 and below average household income over the last 8 years to neighboring states who have more affordable housing. So with that, I'm interested in hearing more of your thoughts and sharing some of my views on how we can help turn this around. Despite the dark cloud of the COVID-19 pandemic, I do see some silver linings that we can all work together on.
Great, thank you, Mel. So for those of us on the call, I wanted to let you know there's about 40 of us gathered. It feels like we're talking amongst ourselves, but there is an audience out there. And appreciate all those opening thoughts. I hope this promises to be a robust and engaging conversation. So as I said earlier, what I'd like to do is direct a question to each panelist and then open it up to questions from the participants. Again, if you'd like to submit a question, please do so in the chat feature on Zoom or by way of the Pathable platform. Either way, you're watching this one of two ways. Either way, those questions will get to us. I see there's already at least one question in the chat feature, so we'll be sure to get to those shortly. So again, I'd like to start with Greg. And Greg, once again, for those of you who are just joining us, is from Managing Director, leads the Trammell Crow LA office, and is a developer. Craig, I'd like to ask you to articulate some of the challenges that you and your fellow developers are facing today while trying to get a project entitled and try to get it built. And specifically, how are you guys adapting to the challenges of the pandemic, and how are innovations being accelerated by way of the necessity the pandemic poses upon all of us?
Sure, I'll try my best to hit both of those. But you know, when we think about the challenges associated with the developing or entitling or running projects in the pandemic environment, you know, you've got two issues. One is the Zoom interface and how we're handling community outreach and these types of things, and you know, how planning is managing the process. And that's kind of, we're all in this together. What I'm going to focus on is a little bit different, and that is the investment environment that we're facing as it relates to even the decision to enter into these types of pursuits. So, you know, what we have in front of us is this, you know, once in a century, once in a lifetime type of environment, and it's created a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And if there's one thing that investors hate, it's uncertainty. And real estate development is really just an extension of the investment community, because we are placing dollars that are part of pension funds, life insurance companies, investment portfolios, trying to help them you know, make good on the forecasts and the commitments that they've made to their members. And so it's figuring out ways that we can safely place that capital on their behalf in order to get the types of returns that they need to make good on those commitments. You know, right now, in spite of the uncertainty that we face, you know, a good indicator, or actually the saving grace for many of us, is the strength of the stock market. And the stock market is actually holding up a lot of those portfolios very well. In the last couple of cycles that we had, stock market went crashing down, and as a result, many investors were over allocated in real estate, just as it related to, you know, what we call the denominator effect. When the denominator gets smaller because you've lost a bunch of money in stocks, all of a sudden your real estate holdings are too big. And that causes a complete slam on the brakes for real estate investment. We haven't seen that. So it's funny how the two are related, but they very much are. In this case, it's the one, I guess, silver lining that we see of the current dynamic. But for us, our biggest proxy that we look for when we make investment decisions is job growth. If we had to cycle in on one specific element, it's job growth. And it's because it's a proxy for incomes, it's a proxy for consumer confidence, it's a proxy for consumer spending, it's a proxy for occupancy requirements. So if we could point at one number, it's job growth. And unfortunately for us right now, that's not a great number. It's highly problematic. And we had a little bit of uptick, but now we're having, you know, closures, you know, hitting Europe, and everybody's going, you know, wondering what's going to happen here for us for the end of the year. There's a great deal of uncertainty. From a data perspective, what we are certain about is actually not that great. You know, we've seen rents in Greater Los Angeles drop 10% since the beginning of COVID, and those, you know, vary depending on submarket and your specific class of product type, but let's just, for sake of convenience, let's call it 10%. We're also, on average, I think most multifamily landlords are between down 15 to 20% on their collections. So big picture, if you were 100% occupied and your rents are down 10% and your collections are down 20%, your best case scenario collecting 72% of what you were hoping to collect. That might be enough to pay the operating expenses, the real estate and property taxes, and everything else that goes along. Right now, multifamily ownership in Greater LA is almost a break-even proposition at best. And that's a big challenge. So you need to make a lot of assumptions that things are going to get better in the future in order to make the investment decisions that we are. And Wall Street Journal did a fantastic article last couple of days on the outstanding renter obligations, right? Moody's has forecasted we've got 12.8 million renters in the United States that on average owe $5,400 each in back rent. That's a $70 billion really unfunded investment shortfall. And so that's a pill that folks have got to swallow before they decide to spend more money on housing and more money on multifamily. And that, much more so than Zoom, planning hearings and whatnot, is the greatest challenge that we're facing right now as it relates to creating housing in Southern California. And of course, you add to that things like Prop 21. And regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, the challenge from an investment perspective is in California, if you own real estate, you always risk waking up in a new regulatory environment. The rules can be changed very, very, very quickly. And that creates, again, one more time, uncertainty. And so the net impact of that uncertainty is, again, either a reluctance to invest or a demand for higher reward for having taken that risk. And so I could go on and on, but I will throttle back because I want to hear what everyone else has to say. Look, every single one of these projects that even Jack mentioned, right? His clients are continuing to pursue their entitlements, and Vince will certainly point to the fact that he's processed a record number of applications and entitlements in the last year. Those don't all necessarily result in new housing. And it's because while everyone focuses on the uncertainty related to the time frame of the process, that is what it is, and everybody's working hard to address it. There's also uncertainty related to the outcome. Just how many bells and whistles are going to get tacked onto your project and various asks as you go through the process, and can a project that was, again, that cake mix was put into the entitlement oven 1 or 2 or 3 years earlier, do the set of assumptions that you put together as a developer and investor on the front end still pass muster when the cake comes out of the oven? Can you actually build that which you entitled and negotiated to build over that period? And if you're popping out right now with entitlements, you're going to be on ice for quite a while. And a lot of those projects are probably, type 1, more expensive, higher rent requirement projects. And so those are going to linger much longer. So, what are we doing? The second piece of the question, I'm going to hit it super fast, is we're very much looking for lower risk, higher predictability projects, either by right or allowed or CEQA exempt, or every possible deal that we can find to mitigate risk. And the problem is those are smaller projects. They're less impactful projects, but they're the only ones that have the potential of really passing that muster of all of those variables in the current environment. So what everyone else here can do is exactly what VICA does. And thank you, VICA, for everything you do. You support projects, you fight for housing, you attend hearings, and that's what every single one of us needs to be doing. We need to be writing planning commissioners or city council members. We need to be showing up at our neighborhood council meetings to support housing. And let's not candidly quibble about all of the specific details of a project, because again, you can win the battle and lose the war by fighting to have a project be exactly, perfectly, precisely what you want, and then it's simply unbuildable and never happens. And as a developer, you really don't know if it's going to work until you pop out on the other side, which is just such a tremendous level of pushback from those of us who are advocates of actually building the housing, because we've all been there. We stood there with a project that we spent 2 or 3 or 4 years working through the system, and now it just doesn't work. And that's unfortunately a dynamic that we're in, and every single one of us is going to have to pull hard and fight hard for our projects to work.
Thank you, Greg. That was a great metaphor. I'm going to use it without attribution in the future with baking the cake. I'd like to turn it over to Vince now and ask Vince to talk a little bit about how the planning department has adapted in this COVID environment to keeping projects and entitlement applications moving forward. And do you see any of these adaptations being transformative or accelerating changes beyond this? And specifically, I'd like to also address public participation in that Historically, people have had to, take a day off of work, find parking, come to City Hall, go through security to weigh in on development in their communities. Now you can participate in your bunny slippers and pajamas at home. And so that's changed the landscape a little bit. So if you would enlighten us a little bit about the planning department and what it's saying. And
so when COVID-19 started, we had to move pretty quickly, right? Our first priority was to keep our development service centers open, because that was really the influx of the projects. That's where things get sign-offs are. Building and safety was prior to them to keep their inspections going as well as their plan check, and they did. And so that was our first priority that we did. Then we had to transition from physical in-person meetings to virtual meetings. And so like this on Zoom. And that there's a little bit of a ramp up that occurred with that, but now all of our meetings are online in a Zoom, I think they're all in a Zoom format now. And we do actually about 115 meetings a month on average. And it's the interesting thing, so we do everything. So right now we're updating, we're on a huge process to update our community plans. And so we're partway through this effort. In fact, we're updating all of the plans in the South Valley, both the Southwest Valley and the Southeast Valley. We're updating all of those community plans right now. And as well as a lot of citywide policy initiatives that also are related to housing, as well as all of our hearings for development projects. So we transitioned all of those to online, and it's an interesting thing because when it has actually really increased public participation tremendously in this time frame. And so we have seen a huge increase in policy planning. And we've also seen a much larger variety of people who are actually now participating in the process. So for example, in the past, I think on average, we're somewhere between 5 to 10 times more people in our policy planning in terms of the type of engagement we're getting, and the amount of variety of people from their backgrounds and their interests in what they do is also expanded tremendously. It's actually a much broader demographic that's getting engaged with policy planning. So we're actually now seeing our plans getting input with, I think, a broader range of viewpoints and perspectives than we've had in the past. So I'm excited to see how that turns out in terms of differing types of policies and what ends up with our plans. But also development projects have a lot more people coming in too, and they're dialing in online. So all of our hearings are taking much longer. I think that in our commission hearings, they're going maybe about 2 or 3 times as long as they have in the past. So that's been, from a hearing standpoint and a public input standpoint, it's been very positive. It's a lot more work. Now, when it comes to development projects, we've been starting to put our services online. So we've been doing, we do all of our payments now online for all of our types of application. We're moving our applications online. We started to do parts of our TOC, Transit-Oriented Communities, where we do our tier verifications online. We do pre-applications online. We've moved. We're putting all of our services online, and we're hoping to get through that as we go into next year, probably sometime around probably about mid-year to around fall. We should have all of our applications online and going through the process. Actually, all of our application submittals will be online in a shorter period of time. So we're looking at that as this is something that's an opportunity with how we deal with our intake of development projects, as well as how they're processed through and handled in the planning department. We're seeing that to go online, and we're going to see that in finished sometime next year. We think that's going to be a real benefit to everyone because it's going to make it much easier for us to go through the review process. We'll be much more clearer. Anyone who's interested in the public will have access to the information. So anybody who wants to understand an entitlement will be able to see that fairly quickly. We're going to be looking at, especially in our policy planning area, which is largely staff members going to communities. We will be continue that format in some way as we go past COVID-19. When it comes to public hearings, such as commission meetings, we have very specific requirements under state law and the Brown Act that we have to comply with. So there's a little bit of a challenge there to kind of split the format. I mean, the format can either be right now in person, which we don't do, or we have under the governor's orders being able to do the meetings virtually. And that required an order from the governor to do that, an emergency order to do that. But we're going to be looking at is there a way that we can continue some of that for the hearings into the future? That some of that will be a little bit tricky to do. And as we've been going through, we've been looking at ways that we can streamline our procedures as part of it. So part of it is streamlining through technology. The other part of it is what we can do in terms of streamlining our procedures. We've spent some time in the last few years working through how do we make things more, take some more projects through our policy planning and make them either more ministerial or make the process that you go through more minimal. So we've taken advantage of something called Community Plan Implementation Overlays, or CPIOs, that offer more of a staff level review. Just some stats in terms of just the average numbers of takes to completion. I know there's going to always be outliers, and I know there's always going to be people with frustration because we can never move fast enough, and this is government, and there's a lot of public input. But we've been working hard in trying to do things such as look at our environmental review and see how we can streamline it. We've had a huge reduction in the amount of, for example, mitigated negative declarations. If you go back 4 or 5 years to 2016, 2015, mitigated negative declarations is part of the California Environmental Quality Act. It's kind of the mid-level review between an environmental impact report and a categorical exemption. Those used to be about 40% of all of our environmental review. Now they're going down to about 1.3% or a little bit about 1.5%, and that's largely been replaced by moving those over to categorical exemptions. What that means is it goes through the process typically more quickly and more smoothly than in the past. And these are very specific exemptions put forward by the state of California. So we've been working on streamlining like that. In terms of how that's ended up, if you look back in 2016, 2017, it took us, if you looked at all housing projects, where the average, some are quick, some take a lot longer, was about 8 months to go from to get completed. That went down to about 5 months, which is about a 40% reduction. And that's been through both streamlined in terms of what we do for environmental review, but also our incentive programs such as transit-oriented communities as well as density bonus. So there's been some things we've been doing in COVID-19 to really kind of continue some of those streamlining efforts that we've had, and we've tried to look at COVID-19 to see what more of those kind of streamlining opportunities that we do have. And I could probably talk about this for a long time, so I'll maybe end right there and turn it over to somebody else.
Great, thank you. And again, for those of you who are participating, please feel free to begin submitting your questions to the chat feature. We'll hear from 3 more of our panelists, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I'd like to now turn it over to you, Ran, and ask you to pull out your crystal ball. You do a lot of research on real estate and investment. So where do you see the market going post-pandemic? Where are the opportunities? Where are the pitfalls? What does your future telling tell us?
Well, let me rub my crystal ball and see what's going on. I don't know, actually. I mean, let's just stay with the housing a little bit. This just in short-term future, like what's going on in 2021. And I think this is a very unique environment in investments right now. Like what Greg, I'm trying to echoing what Greg was saying. Like nobody even know what 2021 will look like in real estate right now, because we don't know how the government intervention, how deep it's going to go, how long it's going to go, who is going to be protected, who is going to get left out. And so in terms of in real estate, commercial real estate market, of course, you know, we've seen a huge decline in hotel properties and retail properties. And we've seen a lot of, I've heard a lot of private activities right now trying to negotiate deals to buy those distressed properties. But who knows if the deal gonna go through, because the underwriting, all the things are extremely hard right now. And in terms of multifamily, there was a little dip at initial during the pandemic, but now has picked up quite, it's wild, it's fine. A lot of those high quality properties have not a lot of collection issues. But of course, if you look at the average, yes, the collection rate has gone down. So that of course gonna affect people's, you know, all the cap rate forecasts like where we're gonna put the cap rate. Like a lot of people using the reference, right? In behavior finance, we use a lot of our past behavior to predict future behavior. But if you use 2019 data to predict what's going on in 2021, 2022, you may be significantly biased because things have changed. We consider there's a structure break right now that we're experiencing. And for affordable housing, and I think one of the things I've been very interested in, and actually just came in news a couple of weeks ago, is about the real estate investment trust participation in affordable housing, right? So I think many of you seen the news. There will be the first Black-owned public REIT. They already filed IPO with SEC. It's called Arise. I think Arise Partners or Arise Capital. One of the firm is from Southern California, and they form a unique enterprise. And affordable housing REITs are not a unique or not anything new. The first one was kind of created in 2012, 2013 as a private REIT. And I think that's the real estate investment trust participation in the affordable housing market can somehow, I think, I mean, I'm a big advocate of the REIT industry myself because I do a lot of research in it. And I think it can somehow iron out some of the frictions or limited participation in the affordable housing market because they can raise money quite easily. I think the soon to be IPO'd Arise, they already raised over $2 billion right in their capital, and they already have pipeline. And one of the biggest struggles in affordable housing problem, because affordable housing is very localized, right? If you ask everybody in US, everybody will have a different definition about affordable housing because people live in different neighborhoods, in different cities. And housing crisis is very regional, very localized. However, capital is globalized, right? So when we're talking about how to invest, we don't, as an investor, and I think many of you, whether it's Greg's company or Jack's clients, when I'm looking at my money, I don't have to invest in Los Angeles. I can invest in Arizona, I can invest in Idaho, I can invest in Texas. How do you attract the money into this housing crisis? I think the incentive, like what Mel was mentioning at the beginning, how do we provide the incentive for the investors actually put the money? We have so many developers, so many real estate investment companies in Southern California, but if you look at their property holdings, very little percentage actually in Southern California. And that tells you they don't have the incentive. They would rather to invest in Arizona rather than put their money in their backyard. And that's I think that's the biggest struggle for every policy, every regulation. We don't want any more regulation from the finance point of view and academic point of view, because that will increase even more frictions on how the capital flow into those markets. And because we are in this question, the whole panel question is like, how do we build more housing? How do we supply more housing into the market? And I would ask, like, I mean, from academic point of view, I would ask, I may not have all the answers, but I like to ask questions. And I think that's what college professors are good at. And I would add on even more questions. Is supply, just increase the supply enough for Southern California, for Los Angeles, right? There are a lot of literature already done that, saying that just purely supply more in the housing market is not going to solve the housing crisis. It's not going to solve the affordable housing problem. The reason why is you have to look at elasticity, right? It's about the supply elasticity, how the price sensitive to it. And there are research that I've read, particularly looking at Los Angeles, you can provide 50,000 more housing units of housing for the next 5 years. The price, the average rent probably dropped 1-2%. That's it. You're not going to have, the reason why is I think what I'm very advocate is about the neighborhood choosing of where the affordable housing is, and also about the amenities in the neighborhood. There's a trend in the developers, they go into the already pretty good neighborhood and then develop, which is good. You integrate a lot of low-income population into the higher income neighborhood. But if you would really transform a neighborhood, it's not just about building the housing there, but also have amenities, schools, healthcare, public transportation, entertainment. So people, low income population, they have a choice as well. They would like to live in somewhere they can enjoy their life, right? So they can have a better quality. So I think in terms of overall real estate in general, I'm not really sure. I think people, if you're contrarian investors, you will go into buying more distressed properties right now, because everybody, if you want to unload, they probably have some liquidity problem. You probably can take advantage of that. But for people who already have Class A buildings or even Class B buildings, they probably just want to write it out and see how it works. And in terms of all the interventions that are going to take into effect all the way until to the 2021. All right,
thank you.
I'll give it back to you, Josh. Thank you.
Thank you, Rand. I'd like to turn our focus now towards Sacramento a little bit, and I'd like to ask Jack to talk about some of the recent state legislation and CEQA, and to address how that's either helping or hindering some of the development, including affordable development, affordable housing. So, Jack, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Josh. I think given the comments that Greg and Vince made about the use of CEQA exemptions, I'd like to start there. So some of you may know for 30 years, the development community has tried to persuade the legislature to really overhaul CEQA to streamline its use. And those efforts have failed largely, and I think they're going to continue to fail, with one notable exception. The legislature and the State Office of Planning and Research, which implements CEQA, have been willing to provide more CEQA exemptions or streamlining for housing projects, other projects too, but mostly for housing projects. And in the wake of COVID-19 and the severe budget constraints that the city of Los Angeles and probably every other jurisdiction are now facing, it's become even more important to employ these exemptions, both to reduce staff time required to process projects, since there likely will be less staff time available to review these projects, and in particular CEQA documents, and to reduce development costs and the timeline for securing entitlements, both of which have steadily and significantly increased over the past decade for many projects, in particular those that require EIRs. I will note that the city of LA has had some notable successes in streamlining the process. In particular, I'd point to the expedite unit. I think that's been terrific, and many projects now are able to get through the process through expedite very quickly, and often with CEQA exemptions. So I'll make three specific observations about that. In expedite and other and elsewhere in the planning department, on behalf of our developer clients, we often employ what's called the Class 32 categorical exemption for infill housing projects. And the city has encouraged the use of that exemption. It effectively requires the preparation of a partial initial study. We commonly call it a CADX study, to demonstrate that the project's consistent with applicable zoning regulations and won't have certain significant environmental impacts. But it involves substantially less cost and takes a lot less time than doing a full initial study, or God forbid, an EIR. There's no public comment period. And for various reasons, project opponents often seem to overlook that document and don't challenge it. So I also point out that there's two other mechanisms for avoiding or streamlining review that are being increasingly used and need to be used more. So one of them is a statutory exemption, commonly known as a SCIPI, or Sustainable Communities Project CEQA exemption. That's a full exemption, or the preparation of what some of you know to be a SCIA, or Sustainable Communities Environmental Assessment, which allows for streamlined CEQA review. The problem has been that there are numerous requirements. I should say the challenge has been that there are numerous requirements to satisfy to use either of those exemption or streamlining procedures. But it is worthwhile to go carefully through those list of requirements and try to conform your project to them if you can do so at a reasonable expense. because they can save a significant amount of time in the entitlement process. I think there's going to be an increasing use of those mechanisms in the future. And I'm hopeful that the city of LA and other jurisdictions will do everything they can to make it easier for those mechanisms to be used. And finally, I just want to note that Warner Center is obviously the hub of development activity in the Valley. And there is an additional statutory exemption that's available for some of those projects in Warner Center. For those of you who are interested, it's section 21155.4 of the California Government Code. And it says that a project can be exempt from environmental review, or is exempt, if it is in a specific plan area for which an EIR has been certified. So Warner Center is subject to the Warner Center 2035 plan, which is a specific plan for which an EIR was certified. So any developer that's looking at development in Warner Center should take a very close look at that potential CEQA exemption. And then I'd like to point out one more mechanism, which is in part a CEQA exemption, but more than that, and that's SB 35. SB 35 was enacted in 2017. And again, for those who are interested, you can find that in section 65913.4 of the Government Code. It provides, importantly, that under certain circumstances, a discretionary approval process for a housing project is converted to a ministerial process. SB 35 is just starting to gain traction in Los Angeles and throughout the state. Probably the most important thing for you to know about it is that the trigger for applying it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, which is very unusual. It depends on the extent to which the jurisdiction has satisfied its regional housing needs. So for example, in the city of Los Angeles, a project can qualify for this ministerial approval process if 50% or more of the residential units are at least low-income affordable units. In the county of Los Angeles, on the other hand, only 10% of the residential units must be affordable. And the state has put out long lists of all the cities and counties to show which of them are subject to which requirement. Like some of the other exemption mechanisms, you have to satisfy numerous other requirements to qualify for the ministerial approval. In the very limited litigation that has occurred thus far involving SB 35 projects, the action is centered on whether the SB 35 requirement was satisfied, that the project was consistent with objective zoning standards, objective subdivision standards, and objective design review standards, in effect, when the development was submitted. There's going to be more litigation, I suspect a lot more. One drawback to the process is that if your project isn't otherwise subject to prevailing wage and using skilled and trained workforce, to use this process, you would be required to do those things. And so you have to weigh that against the benefits of potentially having a ministerial process. Finally, I'd note that to implement SB 35, the California Department of Housing and Community Development is finalizing a lengthy document with guidelines to implement SB 35 and hopefully, although I tend to doubt it, clarify how it works. But I recommend to any developers listening that you pay close attention to these developments and if possible, try and utilize SB 35 for your projects. And then finally, just to talk for a moment about the 2020 state legislation. It was a very mixed bag this year. And even as the full weight of COVID-19 descended on us, the state legislature advanced an array of housing production bills that collectively would have significantly spurred development of housing, including affordable housing in California. The centerpiece was a state Senate housing production package that included 5 bills. VICA's Land Use Committee and Board, I believe, reviewed and supported all of them, but not a single one reached the governor's desk. As a couple of examples, SB 902 would have permitted local governments to override local ballot measures, zoning, and environmental review to allow up to 10 units on any parcel in a transit-rich, job-rich, or infill location. SB 1085 was one of my favorites. Among other things, it would have allowed the use of a density bonus when you provide moderate income housing, 20% moderate income housing, as opposed to very low or low income housing, which is the only type of affordable housing at the moment you can provide to get the density bonus. But they all failed. Only one actually reached the last day of the legislative session, where from what I've read, while it got through the assembly, it was delayed, so it could never get back to the Senate for a final vote. And there's various reasons for that. The bills that were produced were more modest, that were approved by the legislature and then signed into law by the governor, were more modest in scope. Just a couple of quick examples. AB 725 requires that at least 25% of a metropolitan jurisdiction's share of regional housing needs for moderate income housing or above moderate income housing be allocated to sites with zoning that allow at least 4 units of housing, although that one's not going to take effect for a year. One that particularly interested me, because we have several clients who are religious institutions, is AB 1851 allows religious institutions to develop housing on their property, and it provides that replacement parking is not required. And that's interesting because a recent study determined that there are about 38,000 acres of land in California that are owned by religious institutions and potentially available for housing development. So this could prove to be a consequential law. We'll wait and see. And then maybe most importantly, AB 1561 doesn't relate to housing development in the future, but it provides an 18-month extension for all housing entitlements granted before March 2020. That's a direct response, obviously, to the COVID-19 crisis, and gives many developers a chance to figure out how they're going to be able to develop the projects that they received approvals for, as Greg talked about earlier. So there's a hodgepodge of various legal mechanisms and developments that have occurred over the past year that it would be advisable to pay some attention to.
Thank you, Jack. Okay, we've got one last question for Mel, and then again, I'd like to turn over the questions to the participants. There's a couple questions that have already been posed in the chat, so if you're listening in, please submit your questions in the chat. So Mel, for you, I'd like to ask you to address underserved communities and look at the 1-2 punch of in the context of housing, how underserved communities are already struggling with the housing challenges in Southern California, and then you layer on top of that COVID. What are some solutions we collectively can be looking at to mitigate some of this draconian and disproportionate impacts on this underserved communities in Southern California?
Thank you, Josh. We all know that the current situation is not working for many of the communities that are underserved, and that includes folks that are middle-income workers. There's always a lot of attention going to the homeless and to the very low income, but very little attention given to the workforce. And what happens over time is that those folks who are gainfully employed end up unemployed or underemployed, and at some point move from being a renter to a homeless person. So there needs to be more attention, frankly, given to the folks in the work arena. A lot of those folks are people of color, and they are people in the underserved communities. And so one of the biggest bludgeoning tools that I've seen that have caused a disproportionate hardship on underserved communities is CEQA. And CEQA is used by labor. CEQA is used by environmentalists. CEQA, it was well-intentioned, and we all want clean air and clean water. But the reality is that CEQA, in many ways, is that hammer, just a threat. The threat that we will sue you if you don't give us everything we want has delayed so many projects to the point where they actually died. And as a result, what we're having is a tremendous shortage of housing all up and down the state. And so until we figure out how to put some limitations on at least the litigation portion of CEQA, until we are able to at least find out who in the world is actually following the case against the defendant in a CEQA threat, we're not going to get there. There needs to be more transparency. I'm for clean air. I'm for good water and environmental justice. However, I just think that we need to all look at the big elephant that's staring us in the room, and that is, policies, land use policies that are controlled in large part by CEQA and some of the other things that we see that are slowing down the development process. I believe strongly that it needs to be a partnership where we have public engagement. And now that we're seeing the Zoom era and folks have their mobile device, that's great. More and more folks are engaged, and that's great. I think it's important for middle income workers to be engaged, because up until now, it's just been the very rich who've been engaged. They'd have the luxury of not going to work or have already made their way. And so they get to go to these hearings, whereas the workers are too busy working. Just take a look at a single mom, for example. No matter what color she happens to be, she's having to schlep all the way across town to a job that pays her less than what she should be getting, 20% to 40% less than what she should be getting. And she's responsible to balance all of that stuff and not even be able to afford her own apartment or her house. She's in many cases sharing her dwelling with relatives or friends. And to me, there's no equity there. That's patently unfair. And so I think the way you can address this and some of the challenges, we all know that CEQA is not going anywhere, but certainly there needs to be more transparency in the CEQA process. The other thing I think we should do, and government needs to get more engaged in this. I'm a private sector guy, but just take a look at where we're at now. It's because thousands of businesses are going under. And so it's government that's actually created this because of the pandemic. And I agree that we should shut down things for a while until we get a handle on it. But at the same time, don't look the other way and expect folks to just pull themselves out of a hole that they did not create by themselves. And so I believe that the private sector needs to get more engaged, employers, along with employees, labor, and there needs to be incentives. Incentives could come in a number of different ways. For example, we know that for the low income housing, there are tax credits, mostly geared for those who are the 80% and below average median income. Well, the reality is in LA, that doesn't make any sense for the middle income worker. Middle income workers, there need to be tax credit incentives for folks who are making as high as 150% average median income in order for them to be able to afford to have a place to live. And so having that and changing the way that we structure the tax credit programs would go a long way to creating incentives for housing to be affordable, not only for the very poor, but also for those in the middle. And on the transit side, as I mentioned earlier, I served on the transit board for LA County for almost 8 years. And one of the things that we pushed for was transit oriented communities. And you'll see, I'm sure Vince can attest to the fact that right now, most of the action is going along the corridors where there's transit oriented community incentives that are in place. And it's stretch across the region. I think we'll see more and more of that. There'll be less and less need for cars, less needs for parking, more density as we see it in many other parts of the world. And so I think that there are some great opportunities here. And lastly, again, the softening of the commercial sector, the retail sector, the office building sector really is making great opportunities for housing to be built on those corridors. If we can now begin to think about repurposing shopping centers that are no longer vibrant anymore because they're competing with the Walmarts, the Amazons of the world, that space is not needed as much. In terms of the office, and realize when they can go 2 to 3 times a week instead of 5 days a week. And so the demand for commercial space, I think, will be less. And so we can look at the master plan, for example, the community plan, and look at RHNA, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Programs, and tie those things to what our needs are, and make sure that local jurisdictions are actually adhering to the RHNA requirements. And so, you know, we all need to work together. This is not, we didn't get in this mess alone. We can all work together and get out of this mess. And I think long-term, I can see some real promise for LA if we focus more on the workforce, if we focus more on all of us working together, getting engaged and not yelling and screaming at each other, but actually listening to each other for a change and seeing that there are great needs. Our kids, our grandkids will not be able to live near us, which means that as a grandparent, I won't have the liberty of hanging out with my grandkids. And so on my side, it's kind of selfish, but I think I'm like a lot of other folks in this region. You know, as the baby boomers fade out and the millennials are coming in and the Gen Zs are coming in, I think that we all can work closer together and take this sour lemon and make some sweet lemonade out of it.
Thank you, Mel. Now I'd like to open it up to questions from the participants. And I'm going to take one of the questions that was submitted by way of chat and adapt it a little bit. And I'd like to open it up to all the panelists to address it. Just so you all know, we have about 15 to 20 minutes left for questions. So don't feel compelled to answer everything. And we'll make sure that everybody gets enough time and we get some more at least 3 or 4 questions in from the attendees. So I'd like to start with, again, this is a housing panel. I'd like to start with this concept that, you know, there's been a lot of rhetoric and a lot of reality that Southern California and LA specifically is not business friendly. And that we've seen some of our neighboring cities and states lure businesses outside of this area. So now COVID has amplified that reality and it's accelerated the ability for people to really live wherever they want. As long as you have an internet connection. We've seen large businesses like Twitter and Facebook who employ a ton of people in California tell their employees, live wherever you want. How is that potential migration going to impact the housing climate in LA specifically, and Southern California and the state of California in general? I'll put it up to anybody. Greg, I think you're muted. It looks like you're talking.
Well, yeah, I was actually making sure that my wife closed the door of my office. Work from home reality. But I will jump in on that. Look, I think you know, Mel's points were extremely well taken. We have been, as a society, so focused on addressing affordability and housing at the lowest possible levels. And a great deal of the burden of solving that has fallen on the other side of the pro forma, which has just driven the cost up of housing. And it means that the housing is being delivered to the very, very high end of the market because they're the only people who can afford to pay the rents necessary to pay for everything else that comes with a project. So we've created this kind of bifurcated, you know, stratified delivery of real estate, which exactly the problem. And so focusing on the middle a bit better, like specifically what you know, Mel was speaking to about affordability of housing for the workforce, and all of those folks who aren't necessarily working in the white collar jobs that can move other places, right? We need to make housing in LA more affordable for everybody, and that snowballs. Right. So if you can make housing more affordable actually for the workforce, you actually make housing more affordable across the spectrum because life becomes more affordable. So, you know, one of the things that we were discussing on the kind of pre-panel call that I think is worth bringing up is my own personal observation that one of the problems we have with affordable housing policy, as well intended as it certainly is that it actually risks creating a permanent lower class. Is the opposite of progressive thinking. It's the opposite of what a functioning market should be attempting to accomplish, because I've seen this because we deliver affordable housing. We have to qualify tenants. And if a tenant earns $20 a month too much, they're no longer qualified for that unit. And once they're in that unit, they risk losing the unit if they accept a promotion or a raise or another weekend's worth of overtime. And yeah, there's mechanisms that extend it and give them a little more time. But at the end of the day, who in their right mind is going to elect to accept the promotion if it means they're going to lose their housing? And so there needs to be a mechanism in the system that allows for the transition of affordable units through the scale so that you can go from being a 60% AMI unit to an 80% AMI unit to 100% AMI unit without needing to evict the tenant that's already in there. Allow them to move up the workforce, allow them to move up the scale, but the system's not set up to allow that. And so as well-intentioned as it is, it has the perverse unintended consequences of indeed creating or having the potential to create a near permanent lower class. And that's just should be completely unacceptable to everyone. So the more that policies are considered that can dramatically incentivize workforce housing or can allow projects to transition their affordability requirements to match the existing tenants that are in that and allow them to match to market and go, we will begin to address these problems. But as long as we have this stratified policy that we have, we're just going to exacerbate the problem, which Josh goes to your point of companies leaving the state because it's too expensive for their employees to stay here. And so all of this stuff of jobs going to Texas or jobs moving across the Nevada line or these types of things that we talk about, it's a housing issue, not a company issue, not a jobs issue. It's a housing issue. And that goes back to workforce housing and figuring out ways to create policy and deliver housing to the middle of the market and not just the ends.
Can I add a bookend to that? And Greg, I agree with everything you said. The bookend is that because of the huge bucket now of fees and other requirements imposed by the city of Los Angeles and to some extent by other cities as well, it carries over into the cost of producing a unit of affordable housing or workforce housing. I've had multiple developers just tell me while just shaking their heads that it costs them $500,000 to produce an affordable housing unit. I think that's the latest I've heard. And there's no way we're going to meet the challenge of either providing affordable housing or workforce housing, which is maybe even a larger problem, without finding some way to reduce the cost of constructing those units. I just saw recently the city of Los Angeles is trying to find novel ways of doing that. Maybe Vince can speak to it. They've purchased a number of smaller motels or hotels that they're going to try to convert to affordable or homeless housing. But we're gonna really need to get incredibly creative to find a way to reduce the cost of providing and constructing these units.
Jack, can I piggyback on your bookend?
Please.
So, the cost of development in the primary MSA is ridiculous right now. Sometimes it's even higher than just reproduce or reconstruct a single family home. It's just getting ridiculously high cost for developers, and the impact fees that are associated with those are definitely, yes, from California, it's definitely a problem. But I was thinking about the migration, and I 100% agree with Mel and Greg, is the middle class always gets squeezed in any situation with any policy for some reason here. People who make the median income never can enjoy any social welfare that come from it, and then they pay for everything as well. And if you're looking at the housing affordability just for single family house, in Los Angeles County, you have to make, by the end of 2019, you have to make over $103,000 as a household to be able to afford a very typical 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. And if you look at the median household income in Los Angeles County, and then you look at the affordable housing requirements, and most of them are built at 60% of AMI, and you're having this huge gap between the affordable housing income requirements and people who actually can afford a house, and then people in the middle who actually make the median household income. And they're just nowhere, they get lost in the whole system. We encourage them. And I think the whole census data that coming out of this year will be really interesting to see how the income distribution. I think a lot of times we lost sight about affordability. We're just looking at the numbers and like those point numbers, data point, rather than actually looking at the distribution changes. And a lot of jobs lost, maybe just because of the middle is getting thinner and thinner, And that actually exacerbate the whole lower income class as well, because the, as we all talk about, super wealthy people have a vote in everything because they have the time, they have the resource, and to vote on certain things, and that will impact the whole policy on the local level for sure, because distribution, I think, has changed very significantly for the past 10 years in Los Angeles.
Sorry, I think after 7 months I'd have this figured out. I want to turn our attention to Prop 21, the local rent control ballot measure. No conversation today about housing in California would be complete without a discussion about Prop 21. So I'd like to ask Vince or Mel to talk about what impacts you might see on California's housing stock if Prop 21 passes.
I'll let Mel go ahead on that one because I typically, it's an interesting one. I don't know. I think it's Mel and Ron probably would have a better.
I always ask the question when I take a group of realtors to meet with our elected officials at every level of government, particularly the county, the city, and the state, and I ask them, can you show me an example of where rent control actually has created more housing units or created the environment for more housing units? And I've never gotten an answer yet, because the reality is that I don't think it does. I think that, we have to look at the reality is that almost 60% of our Angelenos are renters. And so certainly when you look at a rent control measure, you're going to have a lot of people who are, sensitive to that idea because they don't know the full picture. The full picture is that we all are suffering from a supply shortage. And until we're able to figure out how to increase the supply, it's just a basic economics, the price will continually rise. And so when you are taking away the incentive for an investor, and many of the investors that I interact with are folks that are institution, and there are others that are mom and pop investors. The mom and pop investors particularly, they are more, they're less likely to raise their rents if they have a tenant that's been good to them and not, create a problem. In many cases, they will not take advantage of their opportunity to increase their rents. And so when you are taking away the incentives for the mom and pops, and many of them, this is their livelihood. They have retired and their sole income, other than Social Security benefits, are coming from the income from that rental investment property. And so folks don't realize that housing providers need to be able to make a living too. If they can't make a living, how in the world they're going to keep their buildings up to date and in meeting all the safety requirements that they should meet? And so when I look at a Prop 21 and a number of other of these measures that have come over the recent time, that the County of LA recently imposed a rent control ordinance for the unincorporated areas. I talked to my friends on the county board, who many of them I served with when I was a Metro board member, and I looked at them in the eye and I said, well, I know you want to make everybody feel good, but you know what? You're not helping this. You're not solving the problem. You're creating this problem, exasperating this problem. So, my answer is that Prop 21 will take away incentives. It will run people from here to Texas, to Arizona, to Nevada, where they can invest their money elsewhere, and especially those that are institutional investors. They're going to take their money and they're going to, march it right out of this state. This mom and pop ones in our local area, they will not be able to maintain those dwellings in a habitable, healthy condition because they won't have enough money to do so.
No, I'd like to,
Josh, for one, I'm going to party crash on the 21 thing just for a second, because this is an important concept that's often missed. And that is one of the unintended consequences of rent control, be it Prop 21 or other, is that it actually removes housing stock from what should be a liquid or more liquid housing market. That is, over the span of an individual's life, their housing requirements change. Maybe they're young and they can have a studio apartment. They start to grow into a 1-bedroom. They're in a couple, they get married, they have a partner, they go to a 2-bedroom. Maybe they have kids and they go into a 3-bedroom, or they move into a house. The kids move off and they go to college. Now they don't need all that space. They need to shrink into something that's smaller. So there's a liquidity of housing needs that go with a normal lifespan and normal life. And what rent control typically does is it locks people into whatever housing environment that they're in at that moment in time. That's what they stick with. So you can have retirees that are in a 3-bedroom apartment that don't need 3 bedrooms of housing, but they're going to occupy it because they're in a rent control environment. And that exacerbates the housing crisis for everyone else. Good for them, and very well it's understood and it's set up to protect people, but it unequivocally exacerbates the housing crisis.
Exactly.
So we have just about 2 minutes left, and I want to just address another question from one of the panelists, or one of the participants rather, who described our housing crisis in California as an existential threat, and poses this concept that, you know, we all recognize the existential threat that is the lack of housing in California. So I'd like to ask each of you, if you choose, to spend 30 seconds or less to find some optimism and some you know, rays of sunshine, and what is happening in this marketplace that may lead us down a path that is more positive in tipping that balance to make housing a right and not an existential threat. So whoever would like to jump in, please do, and please do so quickly.
Well, again, I really think there's some great opportunities with the change in behavior, with folks staying, working out of their homes now more than ever, less demand for office space. I think that we need to really look at, and this goes to you, Vince, your shop needs to be really looking at, you know, shortening the time frame for getting processes done, having a master EIR per community plan, and repurposing properties and allowing them to be used for housing development.
Yes.
I think, you know, just because I'm in higher education, so it keeps me young because I hang out with the 18 to 22-year-old every day. I think the current college students are Generation Z now. Most of them were born after 1999 or 2000. And a lot of them, the freshmen born in 2002, right? So that was after 9/11, if you think about that. So they like a purpose in their life. And I think housing is a very social purpose industry, right? We are providing shelter, we're providing a lifestyle, we're providing a quality of life. And I think the real flexibility in the zoning should definitely, every city is looking at it to find a way to do it. And of course we have the not in my backyard people always. But yes, I think there are a lot of communication that we can do. And I think people have this stereotype about affordable housing. And I think through education, through communication, we can help the general population understand what affordable housing actually is. They're not going to bring crimes into your neighborhood. They are not going to bring drugs into your neighborhood. It is, we are trying to just build a better society. And I think the younger generation definitely looking for a purpose in their profession, in their career. And I think we can better educate the younger generation, and hopefully we can have that impact into the long-term future. And before we wrap up, I was reading a research and they propose, like, for the tax credit, what if instead we do 10, 15 years, we just slash it to 5 years in terms of the rent cap on the restriction? Would that help? That would definitely help the developer in terms of reselling the properties later on. And that could also something that, without fundamentally changing all the policies and programs we have, something that we can lobby for from the developer side, or rather than just take it as is, we say, okay, what if we shorten it to 7 years rather than we have to do 15 years, right? So things like that could also help. Just some side points. Yeah, that's it.
I'll add one thought about a potential silver lining.
Quickly, yeah.
We're quickly. You know, we're all getting a taste of what it's like to have a more reasonable amount of traffic in our city. In all the projects we work on, invariably, the biggest hot button issue is almost always traffic. It drives NIMBY opposition. It drives density of the projects. It drives just about everything in the development process from what I can see. And if we can somehow find a way to take what we've learned from this experience we're going through now and find a way to permanently reduce our traffic impact somewhat through the kinds of things we're doing right now, working at home and so forth. I honestly think more than any other thing we can do, that would provide a larger pathway, a broader band to get more housing, the housing we urgently need in this city. So I hope our policy folks in the city and the people that think about these things and have the great expertise can try to take this experience we're living through now and find a way to make it more permanent without, maybe not without all the downsides, but with preserving some of the upside that we've seen.
Well, I've been asked to wrap up our panel, so I'd like to start by thanking all of our panelists, Greg, Vince, Jack, Mel, and Ran. Thank you all for your insight and your participation today. I know that our attendees are applauding quietly on Zoom. And I've also been asked to remind all of you that the keynote speaker begins at 11:50 today. So thank you all for spending time with us to talk about housing, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thanks again for your participation.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks to all the panelists.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks to VICA.
Thanks to VICA.
Thanks, VICA. Thank you, Kayla.
Bye.
Bye.